Hey everyone, welcome to week 2. Thank you for getting your websites set up. As you continue to sort of flesh things out, make sure your blog page or your blog posts are easily accessible from your homepage, because we're going to be starting to use these together pretty soon, and we want to make sure it's easy for people to find stuff. You can always preview your site outside of your editor to make sure it looks to everyone else the way you think it does. Sometimes it's easy to not publish a page or not publish a blog post and not realize that's the case. So if you preview your own site, there's always a preview button in the upper right corner. That makes it really clear that other people can see what you think they can. Thanks for your bios. The about pages are looking good. One of the things that I encourage you to do this week with your website is to start, and some of you have already started doing this, and that's great, is start deleting all the stuff that we don't need. There might be a contact form or lots of sample blog posts. Start cleaning that stuff up. You don't have to spend a ton of time with it, but the cleaner it gets now, the less stuff you have to sort of sort through later. Makes life a little bit easier. A few introductory comments about the readings for this week. Our 2 readings form kind of a microcosm of what we're doing for the whole course. We're trying to learn about physical and theoretical archives to better understand data archives and automated decision making algorithms. Half the course is archives, half the course is algorithms. And this week you have one of each, and your weekly reflection is sort of a preview of one of your final assignments, which is to pontificate and theorize about the overlap between archives and algorithms. There's a specific prompt on the syllabus, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end. For the first reading, it's an archive kind of history article written by Terry Cook, and quite possibly the most influential archivist ever in terms of the way he's theorized about archives and written so extensively about them. Really made archival studies the field and the discipline that it is today. The main point of the article is actually to rehabilitate the relationship between historians and archivists. And to recognize that archivists are effectively co-creators of history, even though they tend to be sort of ignored by historians as little more than like dim-witted custodians of stuff. And the historians go and look at it and have all these great ideas and tell these stories. And the archivists are really just kind of invisible people in the background. And he's trying to change that. And historians have treated the archive. This is my analogy, not his, but I like it. They treat the archives as typography, right? They're just kind of there. You're reading something in a book, right? If the text is too dense, or the font is too weird, or the lines are too long, or the letter spacing is too little, the line spacing is too little, it's hard to read, and you're like, what is wrong with this book? Why is it so ugly? Why is it so hard? When a book is really nicely formatted and easy to read, the typography is good, you don't think about it, right? And historians have treated, archives like typography. Like, as long as it works and they can get what they need, it's fine, until something isn't working, and then it's a big problem. And so that invisibility of the archive and of the archivist and their role in selecting stuff and organizing it and so on is something that Cook is trying to sort of fix. And that's really interesting, and I hope you enjoy reading about it. It's not the primary reason why I want us to use this article. I'll get into those right now. Cook mentions archives as sites of power, both in the present in terms of how it shapes what histories get written, and in the past as ways of sort of creating real power. And this is an idea that we explore a lot next week. That's the whole theme for the week, is power next week. But I want to provide 2 examples of archival power, because they're very relevant to how you might apply them to algorithms and vice versa for your assignment this week. So Cook mentions how medieval archives were collected, and then not just collected. We think of archives as this like accretion exercise. You just kind of gather stuff and sort it and organize it, and just kind of grows, and then it becomes this record of the past. And a lot of medievalists have studied how archives have been built, and found that they're not just collected, but they're collected and then edited, and stuff is weeded out and stuff is added in, as if it existed in the past, right? It's very much sort of Orwellian 1984 newspeak. revising the past to control the present, right? Giving power and legitimacy and authority to certain people through the archive, right? But deliberately manipulating the archive to legitimize policies and empower certain people and disempower, I'm not sure that's a word, other people. Another example, European imperial powers used maps, censuses, royal commission reports to legitimize their own power by controlling the definition, naming, and categorizing of their subjects into sort of marginal spaces, just exiling them from, how they were going to be dealt with in the empire. And one of the best, or sort of I think most effective examples, is to think about slavery. And when imperialist powers went out to new lands, right, new to them, and found other people there, other civilizations, other cultures. Native Americans, classic example, they were treated as part of the environment, like horses or dogs. They were treated as nature. They were treated as stuff that could be exploited, natural resources. They weren't people. They weren't humans, part of this idea of the story of progress I talked about in the last video. When you categorize people as nature, when you categorize them as assets or resources, it becomes a very powerful way of legitimizing any kind of policy that doesn't treat them equally, right? When you classify them and label them a certain way, it allows you to do, in a legal precedent kind of way, whatever you want, right? Because they're not part of sort of the human sphere. So the kind of classification that happens in an archive and thus dictates the kinds of histories that get written and how people are treated, right, becomes a very potent source of power and oppression. And this kind of defining and classification happens with data too. And there's a fun anecdote in the Algorithmic Culture article that you'll read for this week as well. A couple things to look out for that are useful for us going forward. I like the history of the archive that's presented in the Cook article. It's similar to what we read last week, but also a very different presentation, right? A lot of the same ideas you'll see, but it just gives you a very different impression of the history of the archive compared to the versioned archive article that we read from for last week. Another thing to look out for in the article that I think is really interesting is how the article critiques the pretense that the archive carries some kind of objectivity about the past. And there's a suggestion that historians deliberately minimize the influential role of the agency of the archivist and of the archive itself to seem more objective, right? Because as a historian, if you don't acknowledge that the archive and the archivist have made all these kind of semi-arbitrary decisions about what to save and what to discard, if you ignore those things, right, then it seems like the archive is a more objective reflection of the past, and therefore the histories you tell using the archive are more objective and more true. Cook is saying, no, we have to be clear that the archives are very constructed, right, and that this complicates the claims of objectivity or the degree to which you can say a history is objective. This is similar to a point made in the Algorithmic Culture article, because we do the same kind of deliberately minimizing the subjectiveness of data when we use it to make decisions, right? We pretend data is objective, and it may be gathered in what seems to be a very objective, neutral way. One way I think we can apply this archive article to thinking about algorithms is the way that archivists have deliberately selected and discarded certain kinds of things, and the way that the archive shapes the kinds of histories that can be written. We're doing the same thing with data. So we need to think about data that's saved in the same way that we think about how stuff in an archive is saved. And when we do that, the supposed objectivity of the algorithm that processes the data gets a whole new kind of, analysis applied to it, which is important and necessary. One last thing to look out for. I love how Cook describes the distinction between custodians and interpreters of archives, which is to say the difference between the archivists and the historians. And again, that's not the history of the archive is not so much important for us as thinking about that relationship, because I think the same concern applies to data, and the data we save about our lives that's used to make decisions about us. How much of archival expertise should corporations have, or so people who create data or manage data about us that goes into decisions about our lives, how much should they be trained in archival practices that get them to think critically about misrepresentations and what kinds of data to save and how to contextualize it? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, that's why we're doing this class, is to sort of think through that. Let me give a more concrete example. This is sort of an example that comes up in the article here. I want to make sure to highlight it. What happens when organizational cultures and workplace discourses are now transformed from top-down vertical to more horizontal structures, from controlling to collaborative, stovepipes to networks, executive fiat to internal consensus? This is how the world is going, right? Continues to go that way. For the last 30, 40 years, that's been a clear trend from this hierarchical top-down way of doing business to a much more sort of internal consensus way. But archives are still following these sort of traditional hierarchical conventions of this document gets assigned to this person, or these documents gets assigned to this committee or organization. So we're having this increasing disconnect between the way archives are organized and the way people can find them and use them with the real world. There's starting to be a very fundamental disconnect. And I think we can be asking the same questions about data and what's being captured about this reality around us. How much of that has to be structured and stored in a particular way? I mean, all of it has to be structured and stored in a particular way. You have to do something with data. And the way you sort of put it in different bins and the way you link it together kind of creates its own reality that's different from the actual world that we live in. And we need to understand where those differences arise and how we deal with it. So the whole point here is to say that when you're reading this history of archives of article, I don't want you to just be thinking about just archives and just what's in the article. I want you to constantly be thinking about, how does this relate to data and algorithms? How can we see this as useful or not in terms of thinking about automated decision making and artificial intelligence? Because that's what we're ultimately trying to do. The other article on algorithmic culture, at times it borders on unintelligible. Okay, some of it's extremely clear and straightforward and really interesting. Other parts, at least to me, are really hard to decipher. So if you totally understand it, I think something is wrong with you. Okay, but if you read sentences and you see references to people or ideas, you have no idea what he's talking about, you've lost the train of thought, don't panic. I mean, that's how I felt a lot of times. Don't feel discouraged. You will feel lost at times, and that's okay. I still think the article is very productive and very provocative and very useful for us, despite there's points where it's unclear what's going on. His point is very clearly stated in the abstract, which helps sort of ground everything he's doing. Computers, databases, other types of digital technologies. He doesn't talk about social media, but he could. They've prompted a sort of reshuffling of some of the words associated with culture, this very amorphous idea of culture, giving rise to a new sense of the term. So, what's culture for a second? He doesn't really go into a history of it. Well, he does a little bit. But basically, when we think of culture, we think of literature, art, music, that kind of stuff. And people decided what was culture. This is what critics do. This is what literary critics do. This is what movie critics do. They decide kind of what's good and interesting and what becomes stuff that people talk about, what books people buy, bestseller lists. People are making these choices. And historically, this is how culture was generated, right? It was mediated through experts, but also through some elements of like popularity and so on. But it had a very human sort of deliberate component to it. Now, the author is suggesting a lot of that work is being outsourced to a crowd, which is just kind of people in general. And it's being automated through algorithms, right? So our sense of culture, like what's important, gets mediated by what Amazon recommends to us or what shows up in our search results page. And he's not making a judgment like this is bad news. He's just trying to point out the fact that what we sense as culture or what we internalize as culture is increasingly mediated by these algorithms that we know nothing about, right? And are a very different process from, kind of expertise that you'd get in sort of, mid 20th century literary criticism, telling you what's a good book. Now, how do you know it's a good book? Well, you might go to Amazon and look at the rankings. You might go to Goodreads. You might go to some other library site that you trust, right? It used to be that you found your favorite, book critic or your book list, and you went there and said, what did this person think? And now we say, what does everyone think? That's a very different way of producing culture and a potentially very profound shift. He tries to make his point by examining a few keywords and how their usage has changed. And this is very cursory. It's terrible historical work if you're expecting that. So just know ahead of time, you're not going to get sort of a historical analysis of these terms. It's very cursory. I have no idea how he chose the works that he cites and so on. It's a little weird. But it's very suggestive and very interesting to think that you could look at a small set. He just has 4, but you could do 40. Small set of terms whose semantic twists and turns, this is his phrase, tell us something about senses and meanings of the word culture and how culture is being created through big data, data mining, and analytics. So I want you to think about, don't worry about the details and all this sort of analysis he does, but just get this in your head, that the idea that certain words can provide, and how the meanings change, provide a very unique window on this sense of what culture is as a term and as a phenomenon. How much are data from crowds and algorithms a new window onto culture, or a new kind of culture altogether? One last point about, or suggestion as you read it. So his examples of algorithms and so on really are, as I've mentioned, Amazon recommendations and search results. He doesn't really get into where algorithms, I think, are impinging on our day-to-day life most directly. We get into these in the second half of the class. Keep in mind what he's saying about algorithms in terms of a very limited conception is also happening through a lot of stuff that we interact with in kind of mysterious ways, like our credit score and who gets probation, who goes to jail, and how much your car insurance costs, and which workers get laid off in an economic downturn, right? Algorithms are making these decisions for us based on data that no one person really knows that much about, where it was collected and how it might be misleading, and sort of what sort of structural inequities led to produce that data in the first place. I talked about these things in the intro thing. So everything you read in terms of this algorithmic culture article, I want you to keep those broader societal concerns in mind, which he doesn't bring up, but I think they're very important. Okay, so what to do with these 2 readings in terms of your reflection? You have a prompt on the syllabus. What can algorithmic culture learn from the archives? Which is to say, how can we learn to think more critically about data and its uses in society by looking at the history of the archives and the relationship between archives and historians, archivists and historians? And how can our thinking about information, crowd, algorithm, those kinds of keywords, how can they be informed by how historians have used archives in the past? I also want you to come up and explain a little bit about a keyword that you would pick in terms of explaining sort of how a word seems to have a new meaning in, say, the 21st century than it seems to have had elsewhere. So an example that I came up with, and I was just thinking about whether we should do this or not, was tag, right? You think 50 years ago, tag meant, you put a price tag on something, or you tag on your clothes or whatever. It's a very clear physical label. And now we think of tag, it's hard not to, at least for me, maybe I'm the minority here, but thinking of, blog posts, how they get tagged in a certain way, hashtags, ways of identifying sort of conversations. And it's a very different phenomenon, right? The sort of the singular physical price tag, or a tag on artifact, or a clothing tag or whatever. It's a very different cultural object than the modern sort of social media tag, right? It means something different. It's used in different ways. Still a way of organizing, classifying, and creating a hierarchy of things or relationships between things. But without getting into any specific examples, you can imagine that they're very different things. So that's what I want you to sort of speculate about, is sort of what do you see in our digital world where a keyword, a word has changed meaning over time, or has a very particular meaning that it probably didn't have before. How do you explain that? How does it help us think about the future of data? Take care. Have a good week.